Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. This is an amazing community. I'd be glad to be here just in attendance and listening, and it's really an honor to get the opportunity to actually talk with you about all this. I thought we might start with abundance, right? You know, you and I were sitting here amidst the greatest lakes of all time. I mean, we have so much water in these five Great Lakes that if we spilled it out over the 48 contiguous, United States, it would fill the Grand Canyon before settling at an even depth of 10 feet. It is 21% of all the fresh water on the face of this earth. We have the surface area of these Great Lakes are about equivalent to the surface area of the United Kingdom. And the drainage basin, the sort of wider ecosystem that they're part of, that's about the same size as France. They're so big that if you're standing on the moon, you can look down and you can see them. You can see those little traces of blue. I mean, they have climatary of importance, right? And though the people of Grand Haven know intimately, it has an actual day-to-day effect on your life, and that's just these Great Lakes. I mean, inland in Michigan, the state whose shape is defined by these lakes, we have rivers and ponds and streams and aquifers. You're never more than 6 miles from a natural source of water. I mean, it's incredible, right? Like this is our bounty, and yet somehow, when this water gets to the faucets of many of the people in this state, it is literally toxic. I mean, I think part of what is so haunting about what happened in Flint is how dramatically clear how man-made this crisis is, right? I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the city of Flint and maybe from there, maybe lived there, maybe worked there. But just to bring a little bit about what this, bring a little bit of the spirit of Flint in the room. It's a city of about 97,000 people, the founding place of General Motors. It's a city that has a number of college campuses, a U of M campus, Kettering University, Mott Community College, Baker College. It's got this really wonderful cafe called Good Beans. It's kind of a community hub. It's got a really distinctive 1960s era city hall with a dome where all the public meetings are held. Over at Burston Fieldhouse, this historic field house on the north side, it's being revived by a lot of folks in the community with all kinds of wonderful community programming. If you go there on a summer Sunday, people are just playing intramural softball all day long and serving barbecue out of food trucks. I highly recommend it. And it's of course a place that has now become familiar to many people throughout the world because of its association with this water crisis. And the short story of how this water crisis happened, just to kind of go over the basics, is that this is a city that, like many of us, drank water, had its drinking water come from the Great Lakes for more than 50 years. Its water came from Lake Huron through the Detroit water system, and while there were concerns about the affordability of the water, there weren't any serious concerns about the quality of the water. In April of 2014, while the city had an emergency manager, it switched to a new drinking water source. The idea was that they were going to use the Flint River as a temporary water source for a few years in their rebooted city plant until this brand new water system that was finished construction. And this was celebrated. There was a video of a press conference that all the participants in it deeply regret. But they all gathered at the treatment plant, the emergency manager, the mayor, officials from the Department of Environmental Quality, city councilmen, they all there and they did a dramatic countdown, turned off the water and turned on the new water, toasted with the river water. It was really celebrated as a way for the city to as a way for them to kind of, as they called it, get back to their roots, self-sufficiency. We're going to, use our own resources, take care of ourselves was the narrative at the time. But there was a cascading series of problems that followed. Lead is the most infamous, but there was a number of other ones. The main problems were that this water treatment plant that was rebooted did not have the staffing or the equipment to treat a more complex water source properly. Most seriously, they didn't treat it with something called corrosion control, which is what you're supposed to add to the water to keep it from corroding the pipes that it passes through. And Flint, like many of us, are drinking water out of very old pipes, often made out of lead, which is one of the world's best known neurotoxins. Why did we build our drinking water systems out of lead? Good question. That's a whole other story. We really have to undo that in all of our communities. Corrosion control is meant to help mitigate the problem, even though it doesn't totally solve the problem. We have to get rid of all of the lead for that. So the story in Flint isn't that the Flint River itself was so polluted it poisoned people. It's that the decisions for how to treat it were wrong and against the law, actually. And it meant that the pipes started breaking down, and it meant that the longer you go without dealing the problem, the worse it gets, because the pipes are literally getting worse, right? So people noticed it. They did everything you're supposed to do. They showed up at public meetings. They reached out to their officials. They, lobbied in Lansing. They started trying to help each other out, share information. They were doing everything that you could do without the power of their local democracy at the time. And but they were continually told that the water is safe. It's fine. Even when a General Motors engine plant was noticing it was corroding their parts and switched to a new water source, they're like, everybody's like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, until everything started exploding, right? And really, we have the community organizers and how they worked with a number of, outside professionals whose authority is believed in a way that theirs was not. That something was wrong with the water, that it's something that you and I are talking about today. But in other ways, while the switch happened in April of 2014, this is a switch that I believe goes back, or a problem, that crisis that goes back decades, right? So Flint in the 1960s, for example, was a city more than twice the size that it is today, right? It's a city of 200,000 people, and it was on an upward swing. That's why they connected to Detroit Water in the first place. They wanted to support what they saw was an ongoing development boom, right? They had not just huge chuffing General Motors factories there. They had a number of other businesses and institutions. They had so many people coming for these, really solid jobs that they had, and they wanted to be able to support them. Flint had a lot to be proud of as a city. It had was a founding pioneer in a community schools movement. They had beautiful trees and forestry and parks. It was also a city that was one of the most segregated in the country. In fact, it was the most segregated city in the North and the third most segregated city nationwide. It was really, literally, dramatically, explicitly, legally defined lines about where people could live depending on their ethnicity and race. In Flint, there were two neighborhoods, Floral Park and St. John's, where African Americans were allowed to live. And this, as more and more people were coming, this got to be more and more of a crisis, right? Not just a moral crisis, as it always was, but a crisis of just logistics. It was getting crowded in those neighborhoods. There was a lot of predatory landlords. There was a lot of, increasing unhappiness with the fact that people weren't allowed to move about and live where they choose. So there was this rising fair housing movement in the 60s. One of its champions was Mayor Floyd McCree, who was an African-American mayor, and really the first African-American mayor of a major American city. He was appointed rather than elected, so it depends on how you define it, but it got a lot of national press at the time. And I'm going to tell a little bit that you're going to see how this all connects to the water crisis. So stay with me for a little bit. But he was a champion of this, and there was in 1967, the summer of 1967, the very fiery summer for Michigan, right, when a lot of our cities were exploding with unhappiness, injustice, and oppressive conditions, especially regarding housing, including in Flint. The city commission that the mayor was part of, finally agreed to take a vote on this fair housing ordinance that they'd been delaying and delaying and delaying. And the mayor gives this passionate plea for it. He's like, look, I'm a World War II veteran. My brother's a World War II veteran. Our father fought in World War I. And the people we fought against can come to Flint and buy any house they want. and we can't, The mayor lived in one of those two neighborhoods, lived in St. John's. He worked at the Buick foundry. He's like, we've gotta turn this around for Flint's future. And the commission considers it, they vote, doesn't pass. It votes down. And the mayor literally weeps. And he's like, I can't do this anymore. He's like, when I was appointed to this role, and we got a lot of national attention for how progressive Flint is, everybody thought that was great. But as he put it, I cannot keep living this equal opportunity lie. And he resigns. And other people start resigning with him. They, in support of it. It started getting a lot of national attention from the New York Times, the Huntley-Brinkley report, started paying attention to the fair housing movement. The mayor was hospitalized for an ulcer and exhaustion, and his nephew, in his 20s, came to visit him, and they were like, where do we go next? How do we get fair housing in Flint? And they come up with this idea for a sleep-in on the lawn of City Hall, right by that big dome. And they do it. The young folks do it. People camp out there. They bring out their sleeping bags. They bring out their pillows. They camp out on City Hall. They're like, we're not leaving until the commission takes up this fair housing ordinance once again. They stay there for 10 days. More national attention comes. Somebody's making pancakes, passing around. Nobody knows who's making pancakes. They were supported by a unity rally of 5,000 people who came out to support the folks at the sleep-in and the mayor, including Governor George Romney, who is also a champion of fair housing. And the commission's like, fine, we'll do it. They vote again on a watered-down fair housing ordinance, and it passes in October 1967. Great news. But not really, because 5 minutes later, there is this petition to overturn the ordinance. and it got on the ballot, and there was this big, campaigns on both sides. The mayor comes back to office. He's working on it. In February 1968, whether or not Flint is going to keep fair housing goes to the ballot. 40,000 people go to the polls. And by 30 votes, it's decided that Flint, in fact, is going to have fair housing. And this is huge. This is huge news. This is, again, national headlines. Flint is the first city in America to vote for a fair housing by a popular vote. Seattle, Tacoma, Berkeley, Toledo, Akron, a number of other places had voted on it, voted it down. Flint has it. This segregated city. It beat the national fair housing ordinance, which at the time nobody thought was going to pass anytime soon, and didn't until the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And so it was a huge deal. It was a huge civil rights victory, and really it came out of this history of community organizing in Flint that dates back to the sit-down strikers in the 30s, right, where they, occupied a number of GM plants and effectively founded the union movement in so many ways in this country. So it was a tremendous victory, but it too had a bittersweet coda. That vote happened in October of 1968. 1970 census was the very first census that marked a downturn in Flint's population. It had been rising, and then it ticked down, and it has continued on that downward swing to this very day, right? And so this means that this city has, when you go there, there's a lot of empty spaces. There's not just empty, huge GM former factories, there's empty houses. And this downward spiral, this is what connects back to the water crisis, has made it tremendously difficult to provide safe water to people, even before this water switch, right? The infrastructure didn't shrink with those people, with the population. It's still as big as it ever was. And you have fewer and poorer people shouldering the burden of that, which they just can't keep up, you know? There was like leaks. They were losing like 50% of their water through leaks, you know, before the water crisis. This is one reason why their bills were among the most expensive in the nation. It was extraordinary, and so they had this expensive water here in this Great Lakes state that has so much abundance that was unaffordable for many people, and then you have this other level of inequality that was showing itself because while everybody in Flint and who visited Flint even was affected by the water crisis. Some people had it worse because those who lived in areas that had more vacancy had worse water. Because when the water passes through those damaged pipes, it moves slower or stands still for a longer period of time when it's moving, when there's not every little household turning on their tap, right? It just moves slower. And a lot of these pipes are big pipes too, like the big mains. Anyway, it can sit longer so it can get more saturated when those pipes are actually corroding, right? So this is one way that you can see how our history of infrastructure inequality in the past is still enacting itself. It's self-perpetuating itself. We've had these triumphant civil rights laws that are truly profound victories, but the patterns are still playing out, right? Like we can look around us and we see that most of us are living in pretty segregated communities, de facto, right? The patterns are still playing out. The lead lines that we have in Flint and in cities all over the country, all of which are toxic, and there is no way to get rid of all the lead until you get rid of all the lead. We have laws that we don't put in new ones. That's great, new pipes, but we don't have any systematic response to get rid of the ones that are already there. What I try to do and try to make the case for it in the book is like how Flint dramatically shows that how we have to reckon with our past, right? Like how neglect, how not paying attention is not a passive force in our cities. It's a aggressive one, and how we have to have this like ongoing care and intention in creating communities where we don't concentrate our vulnerability, right? Like separate and equal, quote unquote, never worked, and it still doesn't work. We can literally see how it is not working, right? It hurt people. It actually killed people with a Legionnaires' outbreak crisis, right? And that happened in Flint. That got less attention, even though that's what actually killed people. That 2-year outbreak of this like pneumonia-like illness related to the water. And of course, you know, Flint isn't isolated, and not just because of the less lead pipes. I mean, we're having like water questions and concerns and fears and threats, you know, throughout our state, right? You know, with PFAS and with there's a dioxin plume in Ann Arbor. What I try, it's kind of an uneasy but true thing. Like we want to acknowledge how some communities are more vulnerable, like Flint is, like Detroit, which schools recently shut off their water because of lead concerns, like Benton Harbor, which is near where I grew up. They're having a lot of like lead issues. They're on the front lines of a larger story, though, and none of us are immune from the insecurity that comes when we don't take care of this water. And just to bring it back to, you know, just to remember again, like who we are, to quote the Lion King of all things, like there's, you know, this is a state that, you know, like we celebrate ourselves. Like we're like, you know, pure Michigan. We're the Great Lakes state, right? Like we're like, this is, you know, the congressman from Flint, he often talks about how Flint is in a worst case scenario. It's a warning. Michigan doesn't have to be a warning to the nation and the world regarding water. It can be a model, right? Like what if we were a place that didn't have an abundance of water, but we also had an abundance of care, compassion, equity? What if we treated our water so well that people were like came here to learn from us in a way that was positive rather than negative. You know, I really believe that we have that in us, and in fact, we've already seen some of that happen. Lansing, Michigan, of all places, is one of the only cities in the country that got rid of all their lead pipes just because it was the right thing to do. We can do it. We have the blueprint in us. I know I've met people who care about this, you know, who have been shaken to the core by what's happened in so many of our communities and really wants to do well and right. And it makes me excited to see what happens next here. Thank you.